I am Games, and today we're talking about Ghost of Tsushima, one of the last big exclusives on the PlayStation 4. So, I just finished playing Ghost of Tsushima a little while ago, and I'm usually not one who's big into open world games for the most part. The biggest problem I have a lot with open world games is kind of twofold. First, that they tend to be very formulaic and repetitive in trying to make a large map that feels like there's a lot of content in it. It's the typical, wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle kind of problem. You'll find lots of repetitive tasks you're given to do in order to kind of fill that world with stuff. And the developers only have so many things they can do with the mechanics and so many things they can do with the time allotted to them. So a lot of the times these big, large open worlds might have a large footprint, but you're basically doing the same five to so things over and over again all throughout the map. The second part of the problem is traversal. This might just be because I'm really fucking old and I grew up on a PlayStation 1 where there was more poly counts in like the hand of the character in Ghost of Tsushima than like the entire games of most games I grew up playing. But I just find traversal in these open world games so redundant. I guess I'm just not impressed by an open world. I mean, from a technical standpoint, sure I am, but in terms of like enhancing my gameplay experience, there really isn't a lot in terms of interest in like getting on a horse and riding from one essentially level to another, where old, outdated kind of linear games did all the traversal for me, and I just got to do the fun stuff. Because riding on a horse isn't very fun. You know, if you have a game like Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction, Prototype, or Spider Man, where the traversal is fun in and of itself, and like half the reason you play Spider Man PS4 is to swing around New York City, that's different because that's actually fun. That's interesting. It's something you could only do in a video game. But like riding on a horse or getting in a car in GTA and driving to where you need to go feels much more pedestrian and therefore, in my book at least, boring. So, Ghost of Tsushima actually has both of these issues. It has a lot of repetitive map marker tasks that need to be accomplished that are spread out throughout its world, and you have nothing but a horse for traversal. It doesn't really do anything particularly exotic or interesting with its navigation between map markers throughout the island of Tsushima. So it's surprising to me, upon reflection, of how much I actually enjoyed Ghost of Tsushima despite committing the two big cardinal sins of open world games, at least in my book. So, what is it about this game that I found so compelling, and what made me complete it at nearly 100% it, despite not being a massive fan of this genre? Well, I think really the most important thing is that the gameplay, the moment to moment gameplay, was really engaging. Uh, I'd started playing Ghost of Tsushima just coming off of Sekiro, and that's a hard fucking act to follow. Because for all my frustrations with Sekiro being so hard, there is very little in gaming that is as nearly as cathartic as blocking an attack and parrying in Sekiro, and the death blows that follow if you do them right. Sekiro had some incredibly cathartic, really well responsive game feel. Just blocking, parrying, and striking back in that game was like the epitome of great game feel, at least from games in the last couple years. So Ghost of Tsushima is nothing like that because where Sekiro is all about excess and that FromSoft flair, Tsushima is a much more grounded experience. So going from the swordplay in Sekiro, where it's very over the top, to Tsushima, where it's much more grounded in a realistic kind of style, in the beginning felt kind of jarring. But what it really makes up for in a lack of like flair, it has a really solid sensation of like I don't know, there's a sense of heaviness to every blow in the game. When you strike someone with your sword in Tsushima, it doesn't feel like kind of like a video game thing. It actually feels like the blade is hitting meat and like getting stuck in there for a second. And I think this is like due to really good sound design and also really fleshed out animation system. The amount of unique animations that you perform while in combat in Ghost of Tsushima is really impressive. The way that like there's unique finishers for a lot of the different animations. Like even if you kill somebody with your sword, that last blow is very rarely just the canned animation of the strike going through the guy, making a nice sound effect, maybe a little bit of hit stop, and then the corpse just drops. There's almost always a unique animation where you'll either like pull the blade out or like do like a spin move where you kind of like release the blade from inside the now corpse and like kind of like toss it off onto the ground, and that really makes everything feel it leans into the grounded nature of the combat and makes it feel very cathartic and brutal and raw in a way that like an actual sword fight would be, rather than something like Sekiro, which is like what a sword fight would be in an anime. And this gives it a very different sense of catharsis. It feels much more just heavy and meaty and just like good in a different way than I usually experience out of video games, because not many games go for that traditional realistic sword fighting. Not like the swords are super realistic in this game. It's not like you're hacking off limbs or anything, at least not outside of cutscenes. But in lieu of not having a sword that actually like, severs flesh and like rends corpses in two or something like that, the sensation of just like the force feedback on the controller, the way the sounds work, and just the animation, they all work in tandem to give your blows a very heavy, effective sensation. And that combined with the multiple styles, depending on, you're fighting different kind of guys, like guys with shields need a different stance than guys with swords, then pole arms, etc., etc. It gives you a lot of things to think about. And then you add in all of the ghost tools, because you can have like, smoke bombs and like tar bombs and shuriken and kunai, and like you have a lot of different options in combat, and they all kind of work together in this like really elegant sort of dance that you can kind of chain together as you clear out encampments. And that combined with the flexibility of encounters, because, you're a guy who starts out as a samurai, but eventually you kind of like realize you're losing this war to the Mongols. The guy who you're fighting is like studied up on like the code of samurai ethics and is able to like use the honor of the samurai against them. He fights dirty, knowing that his opponents won't. And you figure out the only way to really fight back these Mongols is to play by their rules and like put aside your honor, and be just as ruthless and brutal to them as they are to you. And this opens up an entirely new skill tree and tons of new tools for Jin, the main character, Jin Sakai, to use throughout the game, and gives you a lot of options in combat. You can choose to approach any of its encounters stealthily, or the direct approach, like a more traditional honor-bound samurai would do. And it's interesting too that it doesn't ever like pigeonhole you into one of these two approaches. The interesting thing about this is it's not like you're speccing into like a ninja versus speccing into a samurai. You have the entire toolkit available to you. Like you have skill trees and stuff where you can like put more points into one side or the other as you continue through the game, because this has an RPG light system like every game that comes out these days do. But the game is designed in such a way that it never forgets that you were trained as a samurai. So even if you want to play really stealthily, if things go sour and you're forced into combat, a stealth build doesn't have to immediately retreat unless you don't want to. You can hold your own in combat, even if you're not primarily designed to play that way. And the game knows this because there are multiple side missions you'll take with some of your samurai companions that you'll meet throughout the game, and they are not trying to be the ghost or trying to be like a jackass like you. They are still fighting with like the samurai code of honor. So when you're fighting alongside them, they don't give you an option to go into stealth. There are some missions where you have to just attack directly. And so the game realizes and like uses this as a way to kind of teach you that like even though narratively Jin is trying to be more about subterfuge and like stealth, that option is never closed off to you. Like the direct approach is always there and it's always doable. So there's just a lot of nuance to the combat, and the way that the game actually plays moment to moment is really nice. Navigating the map is also something that Tsushima does really well. So many of these games get bogged down with map markers where you're constantly tabbing into the menu, seeing where the next place to go next is, or you're not even looking at the game, you're kind of just looking at your compass that shows you where the arrow is to go next, and you're ignoring everything around you. Ghost of Tsushima's map is designed where looking at what you're doing matters and helps a lot, because you'll stumble across a lot of things like collectible items in the game that you'll miss if you're not actively paying attention. You'll stumble across fox dens that'll bring you to shrines where you can get new charms that will make your character more powerful, and that's just like you find them by like looking and seeing and noticing the foxes that are trying to get your attention. Little gold birds will fly in and out of frame at certain areas and guide you to specific locations and things. And then even like finding where your map marker is, you don't have to like stare at a compass, or you don't have to constantly tab into the map. There's an air of motion to everything in Ghost of Tsushima. Like the wind kind of blows like all the grass and the trees, and there's like cherry blossom petals always like moving through the atmosphere. So everything feels very animated, which is aesthetically great, but it also provides a gameplay usage because that wind is always moving in the direction of where your current map marked objective is. So you never have to really tab into these map menus and get bogged down with markers, because the environment design itself is the user interface for like navigating the map, which is really clever. It streamlines a lot of things and it makes it much easier to go from place to place because there's not nearly as much micromanaging. And it makes the whole like being on the horse, being slow compared to the size of the map and just moving in a very pedestrian, boring sort of way more interesting because it's less micromanaging. You kind of just get lost in the gorgeous environment, which helps a lot with traversal when you're seeing just this assault of color on your senses, which is gorgeous and like pushing the PS4 to its absolute limits. But also, there's things to do along the way because you never know when a bird's going to drop in and show you a cool extra secret tucked away, or you're going to find a shrine where you can kind of stop and like climb up it and get an extra item. And there's lots of small things littered through the world that you can stumble upon and make that point A to point B traversal a little bit more interesting. The narrative of Tsushima is really good as well. It's not like the best story in video games, but I think it serves its purpose very effectively. Jin's stuck between these two worlds of like being a noble and like being trained as a samurai versus having personal stakes and wanting to stop these Mongols and like having met up with this thief that saves his life and kind of like shows him how the other side lives, you know, like a commoner who's just trying to get by, has no room for honor or decency. And now that they're in this losing war, none of these nobles who kind of scuffled amongst themselves with these rules of engagement to keep their conflict in line, that those rules no longer apply when your enemy has no respect for your culture and is actively using your cultural norms against you. So he kind of realizes that in order to like save his people, he has to be more ruthless than any of these people will allow. One of my favorite things about Tsushima is the way it handles side quests. Is that too often games in the open world genre will struggle with side quests. They'll just throw lots of baby bitch fetch quests at you that are not at all interesting, that are repetitive, a dime a dozen, you know, find the lost child, go track down this person's cat, go here and collect 5 of a thing. And these are all very boring. And this game doesn't really suffer from those kinds of things. It has repetitive things like clearing out camps, but instead of like bandit camps or whatever, they're Mongol encampments. So there's a bunch of those across the map that you can go in either stealthily or just barging in through the front door, clearing these places out. But the combat's really fun, so doing that is actually like not nearly as boring as it would be in other open world games where the systems are a little bit less dynamic. But the great thing about the bulk of the side quests in this game is that they're character centric instead of objective centric. And what I mean by that is that there are four, 4 or 5 characters that you meet as you go throughout the main campaign of the game. And they all have essentially sub campaigns centered around their own personal struggle on the island. And so as you play the game, you unlock more and more chapters of this side campaign centered around this character. So the bulk of the side content, besides the main story of you trying to drive the Mongols out of Tsushima, you have all these other tales of these other characters with their own kind of like personal revenge stories or like personal drama, and you learn more about this character one step at a time, as each of these side quests are just like 1/10 of the overall sub story from this character, which makes these otherwise kind of like uninteresting, boring things like go to a place and kill some guys, it gives it just enough flavor for it to feel a lot more meaningful when you're going to a place, killing some guys, learning more about this character, and bringing up some more intrigue that you have to wait a little bit more. And so you get farther into the main campaign to get back and unlock the next chapter of this and continue going. So this makes the bulk of the side content that could have just been otherwise very flat and boring and feed more into the repetition of just killing more Mongols. It has some more narrative tension to it, and that goes a very long way of making it feel more substantial, even if the actual things you're doing are no different from just going and clearing out a bandit camp 99% of the time. I haven't even touched on Ghost of Tsushima's Legends mode. They updated it and added like an entirely new multiplayer mode that I haven't even touched yet. I've just beaten the game once. I'm tempted to 100% it. There's a couple little collectibles I haven't done, just like finding like all the crickets and to let you play different songs, which I never really messed around with. You can like change the weather, which I'm assuming would help with stealth and stuff. But I never found like weather conditions really were that important. You could stealth in broad daylight pretty well. On normal difficulty, the enemies are pretty forgiving when it comes to stealth. So if you want this game to be really challenging, I would suggest playing it on at least hard mode, because I was able to power through pretty much everything without much difficulty on normal, which is how I prefer to play games. I'm not here to like prove my gamer skill. I just kind of want to have a good time. And on normal mode, I definitely had a good time. But if you want something that's more challenging, that'll make you actually have to try, I would say hard mode is probably the best way to play it. There are a couple encounters that can be really tricky even on normal. The Straw Hat Ronins in particular can be pretty punishing if you're not parrying and dodging really well. But before I close out, I was about to close out, but I think probably the most impressive thing about Ghost of Tsushima, and something that a lot of open world games, especially shit out of Ubisoft, doesn't do, is that there's basically no grind involved in this game. The difficulty curve is entirely based on skill and mastery of the systems and not about grinding numbers. You have some options to making your sword more powerful and your stealth. I forget what the small sword is called, but they give a smaller sword, basically like a large knife that you use for stealth encounters, and you can level up your bows and stuff too. None of that is super necessary because no enemy in this game is an HP sponge. Everybody can go down and like 5 hits, even with like a base leveled sword. It's all skill based. Enemy health pools never really increase to large degrees. They just get better at fighting as the game goes on. And this helps them recycle enemies too, because you're fighting mostly the same enemies throughout the game. But as the main campaign continues, the tactics that these enemies use get better and better and better. They get better at parrying. They can start blocking your stuff as well. They start dodging. You'll have different guys with different kits, and you'll have to be able, in the middle of combat, to be switching from a sword stance to fight a swordsman over to a shield stance to fight guys that have shields, and back and forth. This is probably the only area where the controls start to falter a little bit, because switching stances while trying to juggle the auto targeting, because there's no manual targeting in this game. It kind of like you just tilt the right analog stick in the direction you want to attack, and you just kind of hope the game will attack the right guy, which can be kind of frustrating when you're in shield stance and you want to attack the shield guy and you tilt the stick in the direction, but it targets the sword guy instead, because like you're fighting like 7 or 8 guys at once and they're all surrounding you and you're using the wrong attacks on the wrong guys. So that can be a little frustrating, and that's probably like where the majority of the difficulty comes in the game. But like it's never like in something like Destiny or like Far Cry, where you're just like dumping bullets into like a bear and the bear's just higher level than you, so it never dies. Like there are bears in this game and they all die in one headshot because they're a fucking bear. So it doesn't matter if you have the shittiest bow of all time. As long as you put the arrow where the brain is, the thing goes down. Kill bears to collect pelts, which helps you upgrade your equippers and stuff. But like even enemies are like that too. Like a headshot will drop a guy even at the end of the game. The only thing that prevents you from like headshotting everybody is that eventually enemies will start wearing helmets, and you can't headshot guys in helmets unless you use the heavy bow, which has less ammo. So it's just, the combat is so well balanced, and the combat is so much of the game that because it's so well balanced, it elevates everything else around it. And the open world trappings that it does fall back on have been streamlined and smoothed out to the point where they're no longer super fucking boring, and there's no grind that makes that already repetitive nature even more repetitive, because it demands you repeat those things even further. Ghost of Tsushima is like probably one of the best open world games I've played. I would argue that the mission structure and stuff in Tsushima is even better than Spider-Man PS4, which was probably my favorite open world game of the generation. And while I'm a huge Spider-Man fan, so I'm super biased saying that I probably overall enjoyed Spider-Man more, I think that just like the gameplay, mission design, and combat was much more balanced in Tsushima. So I'm interested to get back into it and like try Legends mode. I don't have PlayStation Plus, so I don't even know if I can. But I highly recommend playing this game, whether you're a fan of open worlds or not. I don't know who would enjoy this game more, people who aren't fans of open world or people who are, because if you're someone who plays open world games for the grind, you're not going to find a lot of that here. It's a much more streamlined, one and done kind of experience where you can do the most of it pretty quickly. I think I put like 45 hours into the game, and I think I have all but like a handful of collectibles done. Like I cleared out all the encampments, did the main quest, did all the side quests, and they were all really good. I was never once bored. The only time I was bored is when I finished all that stuff and the only thing to do was to wander around, find graveyards, and collect like crickets. And I was like, that doesn't even give me any gameplay benefits. And I've beaten everything in the game combat-wise anyways. As soon as the combat loop incentives were over, there was not much left to do. But everything that you do with combat involved is incredibly fun. So highly recommend Ghost of Tsushima. Check it out if you haven't already. It was robbed. It probably should have won Game of the Year at the Game Awards. Either that or Doom Eternal. Last of Us 2 did not earn it. But thanks for listening. And if you like these kind of videos, you can become a $1 patron over on Patreon. We do a bonus episode like this every week. So this week, we're also going to be talking about Remnant from the Ashes. So if you want to see another video like this about that game, $1 will get you right in there, and $5 a month gets you access to the Patreon bonus podcast where I answer your questions about whatever you want. But until then, remember to be the games you want to see, and I'll catch you all in the next video.